paper presents some experimental work on a new project in which I'm bringing together gender, space, the materiality of manuscripts, and the concept of embodiment to develop a new way to read legal texts from medieval England. These texts include yearbooks, statute collections, and legal miscellanies that circulated among men of law associated with the Inns of Court and Inns of Chancery. So the Inns were established by the early 14th century, and they formed a social, professional, and intellectual hub for the development of English common law. They were all male institutions located close together in what is still the legal quarter of London. Law students and lawyers worked and socialised in the inns, and they also lived there together for several months each year. The Inns of Chancery are gone now, but they were places where young men would spend perhaps a couple of years getting some basic training before they moved on to one of the 4 Inns of Court, Lincoln's Inn, Gray's Inn, and the Inner and Middle Temple. The Inns of Court still operate today, and indeed they still play a very influential role in English legal culture. Now, my goal in analysing the legal manuscripts that circulated through the inns is not to identify and isolate their legal content as such. Instead, I aim to understand how the conceptual and material space of legal texts operated alongside the material and social space of the inns to construct masculine identity, enact homosocial community, and to perform and reproduce the gendered authority of the law. So these are examples of some of the kinds of texts I'm working with. They represent the accretion of material over the late 13th to late 16th centuries, and in each text, multiple individual manuscripts have been brought together and transformed with the addition of annotations and marginalia, and paratextual elements such as indexes, glossaries, and running headers. And as you can see in this example at top left here, also features quite a lot of just inserted cut bits of parchment that have been added to the various legal cases. So they're protean, polyvocal, and also multilingual assemblages that evolve through interactions between multiple men over time. They represent, therefore, a fluid and open-ended process of meaning-making, and they bear witness to the embodied nature of what was known as common erudition. So common erudition was a concept that expressed the shared oral learning, memory, and customs of the lawyers. Common erudition was created and modified as men argued out cases in royal courtrooms, and also as the law was taught and debated in the inns. It was this oral and performative body of common erudition that underpinned the common law and was the source of its authority up until at least the late 1500s. Now, yearbook reports, which were reports of cases argued in court each law term, provide a good example of the role that manuscripts played in the gendered performance of common erudition. These texts, written primarily in law French with a bit of Latin and very, very occasional elements of English, were created in courtrooms by students and practitioners who made their own records of how the law was argued and, importantly, by whom. Manuscript yearbook reports, which were originally in the form of parchment or paper booklets covering usually one term each, then circulated through the inns where they were studied, copied, annotated, and brought together and bound in larger composite assemblages. So this example from the Bodleian Library includes reports written by 4 different men covering the reigns of Edward IV through to Henry VII. Marginal annotations and paratextual features such as headers with the term dates were then added by other hands. And in this example too, on the right here, you can see very clearly how this particular text, which was bound in the 15th century, is actually made up of multiple different separate booklets. So Robert Constable, a barrister at Lincoln's Inn in 1476, owned the manuscript in the late 15th century. He added his name in the margins in several places, including in the Latin explicate shown here on the left, where he describes himself as, quote, a gentleman, if anyone should ask. He then passed this book on to Robert Belby, who was admitted to Lincoln's Inn at Constable's instance in 1486, although Belby turned out to be perhaps not the best protege, for in the same year he was admitted, he was disciplined by the inn's governors for having a suspect woman in his chambers overnight. But the masculine bond between Constable and Belby, forged by this manuscript transmission and manifested materially through their names in the margins, reflects what we know of how these two texts circulated. They were normally passed directly from man to man, often to relatives or to fellow inn members, and far less often circulated even to men from other inns. So there doesn't seem to have been any open market for these books. Folio 72 of Constable's book, shown on the left here, and this other example on the right from the British Library, illustrates some typical yearbook features. The names of the judges and lawyers arguing each case are picked out. In the Bodleian example, by quite subtle underlining, you can just see it here and here. But in other yearbooks with bolding and much heavier embellishment, as is seen in this example. In the British Library example, flourished term dates have also been added as a running header along the top in a later hand, as have marginal keywords. You can see some of these here, and other navigational features. So this British Library assemblage includes yearbook reports from 1365 through to 1429, along with other reference material, such as a vocabulary of legal terms shown here in the centre. And this is a multilingual vocabulary where we see words in law, French and Latin being translated back and forth, as well as a list of writ forms. So William Kirkham, a member of Clementson, one of the Inns of Chancery, owned this book in the early 15th century, and he identifies himself in the explicate on folio 144, shown here on the right. By the 16th century, the manuscript had passed to a Milo heir, whose family was closely associated with the Inner Temple, and he added his name to folio 1. Headings and marginal annotations added by a late 15th century owner feature more embellishment than is typical of most yearbook manuscripts, and these are a couple of the examples here. But here are a number of other examples by the same man. Now, this kind of scribal flourishing shows lawyers engaging in a form of amateur book production, creating manuscripts that served social functions beyond the pragmatic recording of legal content. The fish motif, which you can see in these images here, which is sometimes used as a kind of monogram, is of particular interest to me. In this case, it could identify Leonard Fish, who was at Clementson and then the Inner Temple in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. This would connect him both to Kirkham and to Eyre, earlier and later owners of this same manuscript. In this yearbook report, the names of some of the most prominent common lawyers of the later 14th century, including Thorpe, Beale, and Finch, are highlighted in bold. By naming them and detailing how each man interpreted and argued the law, the text preserves the masculine performance of justice in royal courtrooms. Now, the central ground therefore becomes a site where the oral authority of common erudition was transformed into a written witness to that orality, but the margins emerge as equally important space. So, for example, an extensive marginal annotation shown here on folio 31V, 3 later owners commented on how the adjoining case was originally argued in court. And they conducted their own debate with each other and also with the men named in the main text, noting different authorities, later precedents, and points of divergence. A beautifully detailed manicule shown here. holding a quill has been drawn in the right margin. Now, Eric Quackel has speculated that maniculi, especially the more elaborate examples such as this one, may well have been drawn from life, with the scribe using his own hand as a model while reading and annotating his text. Here, the unusual addition of the quill materially enacts the social, textual, and disciplinary processes through which the embodied courtroom performance of men of law was transformed into a corpus of common erudition that was affirmed and reproduced through the social space of the inns. In Stowe 386, the homosocial culture of the law was depicted quite literally in this marginal drawing of a sergeant at law, so shown in his distinctive coif, or this headgear you can see here. Sergeants were the elite of the early legal profession, from amongst whom the judges were drawn. According to the 15th century legal theorist and Chief Justice Sir John Fortescue, they could not be created in this estate and degree without spending at least 16 years learning the law as a member of an Inn of Court. Fortescue went on to explain that the coif of white silk was, quote, the primary and principal of the distinctions of dress with which sergeants at law are decorated at their creation. A coifed sergeant drawn in a legal text therefore stood as a material symbol of the masculine legal authority enacted in the report of embellished. But the image also intervened from the margins to invoke the inns as a nexus of masculine status and professional identity. Egerton 2811 is another large legal miscellany with material dating from the 13th to late 16th centuries. It circulated among men including John Pake and John Collis, whose ownership marks are shown here on the left. A distinctive manicule depicting a hand and wrist in a lawyer's robe is found throughout the text, and this belonged to John Collis, who owned this book by the early 1500s and used it as a space for the self-conscious performance of identity as a man of law. At folios 2 through 8, Collis added his own alphabetical and semi-chronological index to the start of the text, which is what you can see in this image here. And he embellished this in multiple places with his flourished, almost heraldic really, ownership inscription. On folio 4 here at top right, the inscription simply reads, Collis made me. A more elaborate Latin colophon on folio 8, shown here at bottom right, states that this is the end of John Collis's Alphabeticum. It then concludes with an aphorism in Greek from a popular grammar text that warned, if you judge badly, God will judge you. This was an apt sentiment for a law book, but it also captured the unique blend of legal and humanist learning delivered through the inns. Interactions between men of law took the form of textual commentaries and annotations, such as the later addition you can see here to this 1329 case. They also took visual form. At the top right here is a drawing by Collis showing a king next to a discussion of franchise granted by royal charter. At bottom right is a much older illustration for a section dealing with the law of mort d'ancestor, which basically was determining how land would be passed on when someone died. Marginalia like this no doubt made things easier to find when leafing through a large composite text, but they also provide insights into gendered social and material practices of reading, writing, and making meaning from legal texts. Now, this last text I want to show you is a rather different animal to the previous examples. It's catalogued as a legal commonplace, but I think it's better understood as more of a personal miscellany. It's quite a small book. It's only pocket-sized, and it's just 22 leaves, and it's on paper. It was owned by John White, who was a student at one of the inns in the late 1300s and early 1400s, and it includes his expenses for the Michaelmas and Christmas terms, as well as a Latin grammar and other study aids. The book also contains more suggestive material. First are several pages of lyrics shown here on the right for English Christmas carols, along with some rough musical notation. Now, these are contemporary with the records of expenses for the Michaelmas and Christmas terms, and perhaps they preserve this student's experience of the elaborate Christmas revels that were held at the Inns of Court, when men of law celebrated homosocial community and collective identity. Written up the side of an early leaf, shown here on the left, is an inscription that reads, "Robert Brome and John White are always good and always will be good to the said Thomas Crim," an expression of masculine affinity between men in the same inn. Towards the back of the manuscript, we get this rather extraordinary pen sketch of a tree and a heart with a pen struck through with a pen. This was repeated or perhaps practiced in pencil without the mottos on the back of folio 20 towards the end of the book. On the final leaf, there's also this fragment of French verse shown here at bottom left. Now, between the inscription, the verse, and the heraldic device of the heart and pen, this example gives additional insight into how legal text functions socially and emotionally, existing as spaces where identity and community were enacted and reinforced. These manuscripts therefore start to come into view not only as sources of abstract legal knowledge, but as embodied avatars of their makers' masculine selves. Now, to date, yearbook reports and these similar kinds of quotidian English legal manuscripts are relatively understudied by scholars outside the field of legal history. And legal historians and the editors of the small number of printed editions of early yearbooks tend to ignore marginalia and other non-legal content altogether, seeing this as entirely peripheral, both materially and conceptually, to the business of making law. However, I hope I've shown that when these manuscripts are approached through a framework that brings together gender, space, embodiment, and materiality, they can offer rich potential to understand much more about the complex ways legal texts were entangled in shaping the individual and collective identity of early common lawyers, and in constructing, performing, and reproducing the masculine authority of the law. Thank you.